Today's daf we're going to be learning is Nedarim daf Nun Dalid. This week's learning is sponsored by Jeremy Zucker in honor of his wife, Wendy Proskin. So proud of you during this season of Thanksgiving. This week's learning is also sponsored by Ora Cantor for Refuah Shlema of Meir ben Mala. Always supportive of my learning, may Hashem give him the strength to endure and fully recover. Today's daf is sponsored by Elisha Gray in honor of Hadran. Toda Rabba, Rabbanit Michelle, and the Hadran team for illuminating the pages of Talmud. Through your dedicated and inspiring teaching, you bring so much light to our learning and to our lives. Chag Ulim Sameach to everyone at Hadran and to all my fellow learners. Okay, with that, we'll get started. Before we get started, two short announcements. We already have a lot of people, almost 100 people already signed up for Circle of Friends, so encouraging more people to join. Again, all resources are free of charge, but if you can help to support Hadran's work, that would be great. There's a skills class starting in Hebrew. The English skills class will be a little bit later, already in January, toward the end of January, we'll be having beginners course part 2 with Rabbanit Leah Sarna, and then skills class with me for 4 weeks. That will take us until a little bit after Purim. That will be a skills class in English. The parallel skills class in Hebrew, we always have the parallel in Hebrew and English, is already starting right after Hanukkah on Wednesday with Rabbanit Chana Dreyfus. So if you want to join, the registration's up on the Hebrew side of the site. I'll be teaching the same material as her. We both teach a little bit differently, so you can even join both if you would like. So that's starting next Wednesday. The topic is going to be 4 sugyot from the second chapter of Masechet Makot, about someone who commits murder unintentionally. So you can register for that. Again, it's free of charge and everything is digital. So it'll be a Zoom class with breakout rooms. And then after that, it will sit online and you can always access it. If you want to go back and access old courses, there's courses that have happened already in English, in Hebrew. This is already our 3rd year having skills classes. The beginners class, there was already a beginners class last year in other words, there's 2 types of classes. One is beginners basic information, which is a lecture course, kind of to fill in all the gaps of things people might be missing. And the second is the skills class, which is actually grappling with text with Chavruta study on your own. So everything is guided, study guide sheets. And if you haven't seen the courses yet, you should go on our site. There's a tab called courses. You can go into the course website and register for what you would like. Okay, we're going to get started. And almost happy Hanukkah to everyone. It depends what time you're listening to the class. Hanodir min hayarak, starting at Nun Daled at the top. Hanodir min hayarak, okay, or yerek, it's different ways of how to even put the vowels in there. But if you say vegetables, okay, this clearly seems to be a little bit different than what we call vegetables. Nowadays, mutal bidlu'in, you're permitted to eat gourd. Okay, gourd in the squash family. Why is that? So there's a debate about what exactly defines something as a vegetable according to the Mishna. Either it's things that are eaten, this to me seem the easiest interpretation, things that are eaten raw, as opposed to, right, that could be eaten raw or cooked, as opposed to things like gourd, which you would never really eat raw. Some people say that it's more, and had trouble understanding 100%, but let's say something like where you eat the leaves of it, that would be yerek. Like, for example, lettuce or cabbage, where you eat the leaves, as opposed to where you eat what's called the fruit. It's not exactly called fruit, but what grows from the vegetation, right, which would be the gourd, where it's not the leaves of it, it's the actual fruit itself. And that interpretation certainly is difficult because why are they specifically talking about gourd? There's lots of other things that would come in that category. Anyway, some different interpretations. What exactly is definitely included in the category of vegetables, what we're going to see now is what is debatable. So right now, the first Tanna Kama, the first Tanna, is, and soon later in the Gemara, and I would bet we're going to see who actually is the Tanna who holds this way, but they're going to say Zala'at, gourd, pumpkin, something in that family is not included in yerek. So therefore you'd be allowed to eat them. Rabbi Akiva Oser, Rabbi Akiva says, no, it's forbidden. Amrula, Rabbi Akiva, we get one of these discussion Mishnayot, which often you find in the Tosefta, not as much in the Mishnah. They said to Rabbi Akiva, I would send you, let's say I sent you as a messenger to go kachli yerek. I tell you, go to the shuk, buy me some vegetables. You might come back and say to me, this is a legitimate scenario. Listen, I couldn't find vegetables, but I found gourd. So could I bring you gourd instead? Comes the rabbis and they say, look, perfect proof for our point. If gourd was included in vegetables, you wouldn't ask me. You would just buy it. The fact that you came back and asked me, listen, there's no vegetables. Can I buy gourd instead? That already shows that gourd is not a type of vegetable. Amar lahem, Rabbi Akiva comes back to the rabbis and says, what are you talking about? That proves my point. Oshema omerhu lo matzati ela kitnit. If I sent you for vegetables, would you come back and say, listen, I didn't find vegetables, I only found lentils? No. Why not? Because lentils are not a type of vegetable. But gourd is a type of vegetable. Maybe, you thought you needed to ask me. But again, you wouldn't ask me something totally out there, right? I would have said something like, you wouldn't have said, couldn't find vegetables, but I found milk, right? What does milk have to do with vegetables, right? So they're using legumes. Legumes also are not really under the category of vegetables, but the gourd must be. Otherwise, you wouldn't have suggested it as a possible alternative. So it's very interesting because they both imagine the same scenario that could happen. But the question is, what can you learn from there? Is it considered part of it or is it not considered part of it? Okay, so it's a very interesting machloket. So comes Rabbi Akiva, and he said, this proves that gourd is part of yerek, and kitnit is not part of yerek. Okay, yeah, I see what Julie's saying. You learn to go to the shuk by yourself. What this makes me think of, by the way, is, okay, I'll give you a good story. I order my fruits, my major supermarket stuff from Rami Levi. So they always call and they start asking me questions. You don't have this. Do you want this? They don't have that. Do you want that? They don't have that. Right. So you get into a whole conversation. And one time they said to me, listen, we don't have the cheese you wanted. We have this other cheese. I couldn't really understand what they were saying on the phone. So I just said, sure, no problem. Anyway, they sent this cheese, which was a totally different kind of cheese. Okay, whatever. I said, whatever, maybe we'll try it. What's the difference? Anyway, I look at the bill. Luckily, I looked at the bill. Now, I had ordered a piece of cheese that was about 20 shekel. And they sent me a chunk of cheese that cost 134 shekels. Now, I was shocked. I said, what? I didn't order a cheese that cost 135 shekels. Like, that's not what I meant when I said, yes, you can exchange it for cheese. So it's a similar thing. Now, that was cheese, and you would think, first of all, the cheese was totally different type of cheese. And, you wonder why they thought that I would want this cheese that cost, almost, not exactly, but almost, 10 times more. Anyway, I was very upset by the whole situation. I obviously called them and they gave me my money back. And I think they even came and picked up the cheese. I don't even remember. But the point is that, that's exactly right. And then you learn, right? Go to the store yourself instead of ordering online. Of course, ordering online is much simpler, but you definitely don't always get what you want. So this is an interesting debate about what is considered the same type or not. If they would exchange it for that, doesn't mean it's the same type, doesn't mean it's not. That's a good question. Last line of the Mishna, which really connects much more with the beginning of the next Mishna, asur b'fula mitzlila. Okay, ful is a type of bean, or they explained it in the Koran as a cowpea, some type of bean, pea, something in that family. The Egyptian type, if it's moist, which they claim is before it fully ripens. Okay, Judy's saying it's fava beans. Actually, I thought that the picture looked like black-eyed peas. Yeah, it definitely looks like black-eyed peas. But anyway, so now, if they're lach, if they're soft, which means like the stage before they ripen, then that's considered in the vegetable category. But mutar biyavesh, once they dry, because they're beans, so they're more similar, and this we're going to see in the next Mishnah, they're more similar to wheat kernels. Wheat kernels end up, you pile them up in a big pile, once you separate the wheat from the chaff, and they get piled up, which we're going to learn is the word idgan, it becomes in a pile. And because of that, also a kri they call it, because of that, these, once they dry, they're much more similar to wheat, in which case they're not going to be considered in the vegetable category. But before that, where they're still moist, they are considered vegetables. Okay, even though, yes, you would think it's more like a kitnit. It's a little bit interesting why they call it a vegetable. Okay, again, you have to know better what exactly it is, how they ate in those days, how they ate things, what it means when it's in its lach stage. It's much harder to understand without being there, part of the reality of what was going on in the time of the Mishnah. So now the Gemara starts up. So just quoting the first line. Now they say, V'ham min yarak nadav. But now they say, okay, now here it seems to be supporting the reading, yarak is something that's raw. and dlat is not eaten raw. So they say basically, how can you say that it would even think to include gourd? Amar ula be'omer yarkei kdera alai. It must be when you said vegetables that go in the pot, which would mean probably, right, vegetables that you cook. So then it would include possibly gourd. Vidilma ne'echal b'kdera kamal. So wait, just because you say it's yarkei kdera, it doesn't mean you cook them. It could mean that or it doesn't mean, there's two types of cooking vegetables in a pot. One is where you cook gourd for the sake of cooking gourd. The other is where you put onions and garlic, right? You start any soup. What do? At least I do, saute onions and garlic, right? And then you add everything else. Why? Because they add good flavor to the soup. So maybe it means onions and garlics that you add to something that's cooking to add flavor to it. But maybe it doesn't mean gourd that you cook for the sake of its own sake. To which they say, okay, so what they're doing here is, by the way, they're changing the Mishna. The Mishna, it doesn't mean you just said yarak, and it doesn't even mean you just said yarkei kdera. It must be ba'omer yerek hamitbashel b'kdera alai. It must be that you said a vegetable that's cooked in a pot is going to be forbidden to me, because otherwise there's no way that Rabbi Akiva would think that it includes gourd, because a yerek definitely does not include gourd. To which the Gemara said, so they already changed the case on the Mishnah. And then they say, which we kind of already understood. I'm not really sure why they have to explain this all, but what's the root of the machloket? It's just kind of putting it into more clear language. Rabbanan, the Tanakama, the rabbi's position, Savre, who says it does not include gourd, kol milti did tzarich shlicha limluche ala lav mineh. Anything that you would need to ask, the messenger would need to call and say, listen, we don't have this, can I give you this instead, is not considered the same type, because if already the messenger has to ask, then it's obvious it's not included. If it were included, the messenger would be able to decide on their own. For Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Akiva says, no, exactly what we saw in the Mishnah. If you have to ask a shaliach, then if the shaliach is asking you, can I use this instead? It obviously must be a reasonable substitution, and therefore it must be, yes, considered part of that category. So that's the debate between them. Abaye comes Abaye, and with Abaye it makes a certain limitation, and helps us a little bit to better understand Rabbi Akiva. He says, "Modeh Rabbi Akiva leinya malko she'eino lokeh." If you go against your vow, lo yachel dvaro, it's a negative prohibition, you get lashes. Comes Abaye and he says, even though if you said I won't eat vegetables, you can't eat gourds, but according to Rabbi Akiva, but you won't get lashes for it. Why won't you get lashes? That's because that shows this isn't definitely forbidden. Rabbi Akiva says, don't eat gourd. He says it out of a doubt. He's not sure. Maybe gourd is included, since your messenger would say, would you want gourd instead? Maybe that shows it's part of the same category. All of a sudden, Abaye holds that Rabbi Akiva's explanation is not a definite one. He doesn't think 100% is part of that category, but enough that we should tell you don't eat gourd. So it's a chumrah, as we say, a stringency, and out of a doubt, we're not sure, so be more cautious and don't do it. But it doesn't mean it's 100% included, okay? So that's our machloket. Now we're going to move to a different Mishnah entirely in Meila, which is a different Masechet. And now we're going to say that now we have to figure out, does this Mishnah go according to one of the opinions or maybe both opinions of our Mishnah? So the background to the laws of Meila is that Meila, we've talked about this many times, but I'll always review it also in case you weren't in the previous Shiurim. Meila means misuse of consecrated property, but unwittingly, accidentally. Okay, you didn't realize. So now it gets tricky, and we talked about this also in the past, gets tricky when I send you to do something for me, and in doing my shlichut, as we say, you're being my messenger, you misuse consecrated property. So now the question is, since I told you to do it, right now, let's say I tell you to steal. Okay, normally, let's talk about basic laws. Okay, I tell you to accept a betrothal for me. You can do that, no problem, right? Shlucho shel adam kamoto. You can be in my position 100% and do what I told you and act as me, right? A power of attorney. However, if I tell you, go steal something and you steal it, you're going to be responsible and not me, because while it's true that shlicho shel adam kimoto, that a messenger is like the person itself, however, there's another concept, ein shaliach lidvar avera. There's no shaliach when it comes to doing something wrong. So if you went and stole just because I told you to steal, right? That was your fault. You're responsible because you should have said, no, we don't steal. That's against the law. So therefore, you're responsible. What if it's unwitting and it's Meila? So Meila is a little bit trickier because nobody really knew that this was forbidden, right? This was a sanctified item that we didn't know, right? It didn't have a label on it, right? Like you go to a kiddush and there's maybe chalavi, or whatever, there's a little thing that tells you these cookies are chalavi. So make sure if you, or I don't know, wherever you are, it tells you. There wasn't a sign that said this is hekdesh. So you picked it up and used it. I had sent you to do something for me. You picked it up and used it. So on the one hand, on the other hand, so it's tricky here, but it's not like you could have said, I know better. I'm not going to steal for you. You had no idea that this was sanctified. Okay, now if you use a sanctified item without realizing, you have to bring a korban asha meila. You have to pay the amount plus an extra fifth to the temple. So, and it's basically like stealing. That's why the stealing is a good example, because it really belongs to God and you're stealing it from God or from the temple. So Tnanatam, the Mishnah in Meila says, okay, we learned this before. I see you're asking where. So if you look if you have a regular Gemara in front of you, there's a little bet there, and the bet takes you, it says it's in Meila Daf Kaf, it's in Ktubot Tzadichet, it's in Kiddushin Mem Bet, and Chagiga Yud. So yes, you were right, it's in Chagiga. Nice job. Okay, so Tnanatam, Shaliach she'asa shlichuto balabayit ma'al. If you do the shlichut, and I sent you to do it, and it involved using something that was consecrated, it's my fault, because I sent you to do it. We don't use this concept of ein shliach lidvar avera because this wasn't an intentional sin. So it's my fault. However, lo asa shlichuto, if you changed, and now this is going to get us back to our Mishnah because we're talking about a shliach who changed somewhat what I was planning. Lo asa shlichuto, if you changed, okay, we'll see in a minute what the example is, then shaliach ma'al, it's your responsibility. As soon as you didn't do exactly what I told you, see what that means, then it's your responsibility. So man tanna, who's the tanna of this Mishnah? Amar Rav Chisda matnitin delo Rabbi Akiva. The Mishnah must not be like Rabbi Akiva. Why? Because right now we're going to see the rest of the Mishnah and explain. Ditnan, as it says there in the Mishnah, ketzad. What is the case exactly? Amar lo, or a possible case. Amar lo tein basar leorchim. I tell you, go serve meat to my guests. V'natan lahem kaved, and instead of giving them meat, you gave them liver. Ten kaved, or I say give liver to the guests, v'natan lahem basal. And it turned out, whether it was right, I said give you meat, and you gave them liver, and the liver was sanctified. No, I didn't tell you go give liver. You decided to give them liver instead of meat. Now, again, liver it's sort of a type of meat, sort of not. It's like the example we gave of the gourd and the vegetables. So therefore, what do you see here? Hashaliach ma'al. It's your responsibility. Why? Presumably because these are not the same type. And who would say they're not the same type? Not Rabbi Akiva. So therefore, the Gemara says, Rabbi Akiva, if this Mishnah was Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Akiva said, Kol milta demim lachalash shaliach minehu. If the shaliach would go to the store, you would send the shaliach to buy meat, and the shaliach would come back and say, listen, they didn't have meat, but they have liver. Should I get it for you? And the assumption is that meat and liver are those type things, that if they didn't have meat, but they only had liver, the shaliach would come back and ask you. According to Rabbi Akiva, that means it's the same type, which means that when I say give meat, it included giving liver. And therefore, when you gave liver, you were doing my shlichut, which means I should be responsible and not you. And the Mishnah says you're responsible. So therefore, according to Rabbi Akiva, l'mo bal Abaye, v'lo l'mo shaliach, it should be my fault, not yours. So the first explanation of Rav Chisda is that Mishnah doesn't follow Rabbi Akiva. To which Abaye says, not true. Amar Abaye, afilu tema Rabbi Akiva. Okay, afilu tema Rabbi Akiva means I can explain the Mishnah even according to Rabbi Akiva. How so? Turning now to Amabet. Mi lo mode Rabbi Akiva de tzarich in luche. Let's imagine this scenario. I told you to serve them meat. You serve them liver. Now, even if I'm Rabbi Akiva and I hold that meat and liver could be interchanged, because why? Because theoretically, if I sent you to the shuk to get meat, you would ask me, they don't have meat, but they have liver, right? And that shows that it's the same type. That's true. However, comes Abaye and he says, however, if I told you serve meat to my guests, and you serve them liver without checking with me, that's not what I sent you to do. That you still have to check with me. It could be, I'll very likely say, there's a good chance I'll say, yes, serve them liver instead. But you should have checked with me. I didn't, right? Even in the scenario we talked about, they said, you sent me to buy meat. They don't have that, or they sent me to buy vegetables. They don't have that, they have gourd. So he says, you're still not doing what I told you to do. It's true they're considered the same type, but not the same type that they're identical. You still would have had to check with me. And since you didn't check with me and you did it on your own and you just served them liver without checking, that puts the responsibility on you and not on me. So Abaye was successful now in explaining this Mishnah, even according to Rabbi Akiva. It could also be explained according to the rabbis, but even according to Rabbi Akiva wouldn't think they're so similar that you don't even have to check with me. So therefore, he explains it to fit with Rabbi Akiva, which now, Itmar Shmatete Kamei de Rava, this explanation of Abaye was brought in front of Rava, Amar Lahon, Shapir Amar Nachmani. He said, wow, Nachmani, which was a nickname for Abaye, because his uncle who brought him up was Rabba Bar Nachmani, which means also his uncle, it was his father's brother. He was also from the Nachmani family. His grandfather was Nachmani, they called him Nachmani. So there's a bunch of different explanations why exactly they called him Nachmani, but it was definitely a family name of his, and it was a name that Rabba often uses to call Abaye. Rava, interesting. Rabba also calls him that, but Rava, okay, don't confuse Rabba and Rava. Rabba with a hey was the one who adopted Abaye, and Rava with an aleph is the same generation as Abaye and always arguing with him. Okay, Rabba with a hey is his uncle. Rava with an aleph is not related to Abaye at all. They just always argue with each other. And in this case, Rava actually supports Abaye's explanation. Man tanna de palagale to Rabbi Akiva. Now we want to know the Tanna Kama in our Mishnah, who we call the rabbis, Gemara called them the rabbis, really reflect a particular Tanna's opinion. Which Tanna is this? We're going to see right now by quoting a braita. It's Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. So the person who argues with Rabbi Akiva holds gourd could be included in vegetable, liver could be included in meat, and the rabbis, which we're now going to see is really Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel's opinion, disagree. Where do we see this in a braita, Tanya? And in the braita, don't be confused, but the Tanna Kama in this braita is actually Rabbi Akiva. He appears without a name, but it's clearly Rabbi Akiva's position versus Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, which we're going to see in the end, which is going to match Tanna Kama of our Mishnah. Hanodir min basal asur b'chol minei basal. If you say I won't eat meat, you can't eat any kind of meat. Basur barosh u'b'chaglayim, the head or the leg. Kanet, the windpipe, the kaved, the liver, the lave, the heart, and ofot, and birds. Okay, meaning any chicken is included as well. So when I say meat, all different parts of the animal and any kind of chicken. Umutal bebasar dagim b'chagavim. If you're talking about fish and grasshoppers, that is not included. Okay, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel omer. If you say no meat, you can't eat any kind of meat. However, mutal barosh b'raglayim b'kaneh b'kaved b'lev u'be'ofot. All those things that the Tanna Kama, which is Rabbi Akiva, forbade, he says, no, they're all permitted. Meat means meat. All these other different parts of the animal are not what we call meat. Okay, and obviously not fish and grasshoppers. Those are for sure a different category. So what do you see here? It seems pretty clear that Rashbag matches the Tanna Kama in our Mishnah with the yerek and the diluim, okay, and the pumpkins and the gourds, as opposed to Rabbi Akiva, who matches the Tanna Kama in this Mishnah, which has a more inclusive interpretation. The braita continues with the Chen Haya Rashbag Omer, and furthermore, Rashbag said, Chavayim, the innards, like what we call the kishkas, lav basal, they're not really meat, but ochlehem lav bal inish, and anyone who eats them is not really human. Okay, it's like this is, I guess he really didn't like that part of the meat and thought, right, it's a bit of a strange statement, but we know that the rabbis make all these statements about whether you should eat certain foods or not really connected to halacha. And now that they try to explain this line, even though this line is not so easily explained either, there's many different ways to read it. I'm reading it in one particular way. Just know that there's a bunch of different ways of reading this line. Anyone who eats them like meat in terms of selling or buying. So for example, the way one of the commentaries explained, I'm trying to remember where I read it here. it was the Ron, it was Ron, I don't remember, but they said like this. If you have a zuz, okay, and you go to the store with that zuz to buy meat, and it says this is a coin, and then with that zuz, you buy the same amount of kishkas instead of meat, you're not human. Like that's not a normal thing to do. Okay. You wouldn't do that because the kishkas are, I guess, worth a lot less and people don't really buy them anyway. So it's basically just saying the innards are a bad part of the meat. Okay. Moving back to our topic. Mishna basar of. So now we have a question on this opinion. Okay. Which opinion? Well, we saw the first opinion, Rabbi Akiva, and he distinguished between, and he said meat includes all sorts of things, including chicken. It does not include fish, okay, and grasshoppers. So what they want to talk about now is what's the difference between chicken and fish? Okay, why that distinction? Right, it's a good question. I'll ask you, right? If there was no meat, would you go buy fish, right? The same way you might buy chicken instead of meat. So, right, interesting. In our day, you don't generally, I mean, it depends. If you go to a huge supermarket, they have everything. But even then, the counters are different, right? You don't usually go to the butcher for meat or chicken, and you go to a fish store for fish. So again, this all really depends on where you're living. And the truth is, probably the best answer to the Gemara's question is not going to be the answers that the Gemara gives, but that the way people purchase things, the purchasing, custom of, or how things went in the time of the Mishna in Israel might have been very different than in Babylonia already in the time of the Gemara, right? Sometimes it's time and sometimes it's location, sometimes it's a combination of both. So, right, it does remind us a little bit about the kashrus thing, about meat and chicken and whether, right, chicken wasn't forbidden in all places. Right? I think it was Rabbi Yossi Aglili who says that, so you're talking about in the Galilee, he was the one who permits chicken, I think, that it's, I forget now the different, yeah, he permits it. Okay, so now let's see inside the Gemara's question, and we'll see the Gemara is going to do two ukimtas. An ukimta is where you explain that the Mishnah is in a unique case. Okay, we kind of did an ukimta with the beginning of the Mishnah because we said it doesn't really mean that he said yerek, it means he said yerek that's cooked in a dish, right? So that already was an ukimta, and now we're going to have an ukimta to the second part as well. In this braita, not in our Mishnah, this is an ukimta to the braita that we quoted. So the Gemara says, Mishna basal of l'tana kama da'asil. So to Tanna Kama, which matches Rabbi Akiva's opinion, why is chicken in the forbidden category included in meat? Why? Well, obviously, because because a shaliach, if I sent you to buy meat and it didn't meat, you would say, how about chicken instead? Basal dagim nami avid shlicha. But the same thing with fish. Right? If I'm making a Shabbos meal with a main course, I'm either going to have chicken, meat, or fish, right? Those are all kind of interchangeable. So, same thing. If they don't have basal, he would come back to me and say, well, maybe you want fish instead. And it will be forbidden then. So I don't get the distinction. So as I said, we're now, instead of answering maybe the buying patterns or the eating patterns were different in the time of the Mishnah and the time of the Gemara doesn't usually operate with answering the questions in that kind of manner. They'll more answer by, we have to explain the Mishnah in a bit of a different way. Obviously, we didn't fully understand the Mishnah. So, Abaye, kigon shehikis dam. Maybe you did some bloodletting before. Now, why is this relevant? Dilo achil dagim. Because after you bloodlet, you can't eat fish. So when you said, I'm not going to eat meat, you meant I'm not going to eat meat and chicken and all these other things that you might potentially be eating, but you're vowing not to eat them. But you weren't thinking at all about fish because you weren't going to eat fish anyway because you would just bloodlet, and it's unhealthy to eat fish after bloodletting. To which the Gemara says, but it's not just fish that you wouldn't eat, you also wouldn't eat chicken. Why? Damar Shmuel. Shmuel says, we're going to prove this from a bunch of places. Timisochel, that's someone who does bloodletting. If you eat meat from a chicken, a bird, parach libe kitzipra, your heart is going to, different interpretations. Either your heartbeat's going to go sky high, your heart rate, because of like a bird, like a bird flatters, starts, flapping its wings, flapping about very quickly. That's how fast your heart rate's going to go. Or Maybe it means your heart's going to weaken like a bird. If birds have weakened hearts, I'm not sure what it means, but maybe kind of like your heart will, like the way a bird flies off, your heart's going to go flying off the charts. Anyway, something's going to go bad for your heart, so you shouldn't have chicken right after bloodletting. So there you have it, that it's not just fish, it's also chicken. So in that case, the ukimta doesn't make much sense. And furthermore, if that wasn't convincing enough from Shmuel, who, yes, thanks for reminding us, was a doctor and did a lot of bloodletting, Vitanya, also a braita says, you don't do hakazatam, not right. You don't have fish, you don't have fish, you don't have birds, and you don't have salted meat. Vitanya, and furthermore, the braita says, all sorts of other foods you shouldn't eat, not milk, not cheese, no beitzim, not eggs, lo shachalayim, not cress. I think that's what it is. V'lo ofot, and not birds, v'lo basar maliach, and not salted meat. So what do you see from all these, Shmuel and two braitas? If it's bloodletting and that's why fish wasn't included, well, it shouldn't have included birds as well. So to which Abaye the Gemara answers, no. Shane ofot efshar yidei shlika. Remember we saw shaluk the other day. We said it means partially cooked, but usually it means really fully cooked, like very well cooked. And most people interpret it with that interpretation here. If you boil up the chicken for a very, very long time, then you can actually eat it after bloodletting. So there is a way to eat chicken, and there's not a way to eat fish. And that's why you could still say that that was in ukimta. Second option. And last thing for today, Abaye amal, kigon dechayvin le'ene. You have pain in your eye. So, the dagim kashim le'enayim, because eating fish is bad for your eyes. So that sounds like a good answer, I guess, right? So it must have been you had pain in your eyes, and that's why you did this. And that's why when you said I take a vow not to eat meat, you weren't even thinking about fish, because fish wasn't part of what you were going to eat because you had this pain in your eyes. To which the Gemara says, but again, we're going to bring in Shmuel with his advice about what to and not to eat when you're sick. Ihachi akil dagim. What are you talking about? Who says dagim are bad for your eyes? The Hamar Shmuel, what did Shmuel say? A kind of funny thing. Nun samach ayin. Okay, that's the order of the alphabet, right? Nun samach ayin. That's the way to remember this thing, which is nuna sama le'inayim. Okay, it's a total play. It's not just that nun, it's not just an acronym, but it sounds like, right? Nun is like nuna. Nuna is a fish. Samach is like sam. Okay, sam is a drug. And inayim, ayin is eyes. So, same word. So this means nuna is a fish. Fish is good for the eyes. So what do you mean? If you have kevei inayim, you have a problem with your eyes, you should eat fish. So how could you say you can't eat fish? It's bad for your eyes. Who said? Shmuel said the exact opposite. So it sounded like a good ukimta, but the reality is it's just not true. They say, no, it is. Hahu sof uchla. If you're at the end of your disease, then the fish is bad. If you're at the beginning, you start having pain in your eyes, it's good to eat fish. Once you get to the end of your disease, it's actually bad to eat fish. And that's what we're talking about when our Mishna is talking about when you're toward the end of your disease. Again, this is a very unique ukimta to the Mishna, to the braita, which it didn't sound like the braita was talking about at all, right? But we're going to say that the braita must have only been that you're permitted to eat fish because you were at the end of either you were after bloodletting or you were at the end of some problem with your eyes, and the fish is bad for your eyes. Okay, so in any case, this is an interesting interpretation. Methodologically, it's very interesting to see. Right? It's a classic Gemara situation where they have the Mishnah. The Mishnah makes no sense to them viewed in the reality of their times, to which they have to then bend over backwards in order to come up with an explanation for how we can make sure this makes sense according to their interpretation. So challenging to accept this way, right? It definitely could be that things were just different in the time of the Mishnah versus the time of the Gemara. Both time had passed and location. They were living in Babylonia rather than living in Israel. And obviously food customs and food patterns, I'm thinking of the word, but food, all sorts of food issues change, etc. Okay, that's it for today. I will just announce now at the end of class that Classes will go on as usual during Hanukkah online, but on Zoom, there will be no Zoom classes starting Wednesday through next Monday. So Zoom will resume on Tuesday after Hanukkah, and but all the classes will be up. They'll be up earlier than usual. I'll put them up early in the morning, and that way you can learn them earlier. The dapim in general are much shorter, which is also good for those who busy on Hanukkah with all sorts of things. So that's the situation. Have a great day, everyone. Shavua Tov, Hanukkah Sameach, and we'll meet up already. It'll be Hanukkah next.